Good evening. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift His countenance upon you and give you peace. That was a part of our reading this past week. Every year when we run into that passage, this is the way that God instructed the children of Israel, specifically the priests, to greet the people. Every year, it affects me the same way. There are very few words in the Scripture that are as poignant and as beautiful, and it is a shame that we don't use them in speaking to one another, and I'm going to try to do better about that. Turn in your Bibles, if you would, to the book of Ecclesiastes. Put your bookmark in chapter 9. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, and then you might want to flip over to chapter 1, which is where we're going to begin. One thing that I have to say, one temptation as to what I was going to preach about tonight. Mark hollered at me across the parking lot this morning as we were leaving, said, "Hey, you know that today's Texas Independence Day?" Well, of course I know it. Everybody should know that in 1836, on March the 2nd, 59 settlers, or representatives of the settlers that were living in Mexican-occupied territory of Texas, banded together and declared their independence, one of the grandest blessings of God, right up there with "the Lord bless you and keep you." So I told Mark I'm going to preach about it tonight. If I go any farther than that, probably bordering on blasphemy, so we'll leave it right there. Are we not blessed people? So, at any rate, Ecclesiastes. If you're familiar with Ecclesiastes, we're about to start in chapter 1 and kind of do a little summation. This was written by the wisest man who ever walked the earth, except for the Lord Himself. I don't know when Solomon wrote this book. I mean, for those who are dreamers, who want to see Solomon in the very best possible light, one theory is that as he got old and after he had turned away from the Lord because of all of his wives, before he died, he had a kind of a return to the Lord and wrote Ecclesiastes. There's absolutely nothing in the historical records that indicates that's true, but I'd love to think that about him. But at some point, especially as he got older, Solomon penned these words. They are, perhaps, this book may well be my favorite book in the Bible. Now, there's parts of it I don't understand, because some of the things that Solomon says are a challenge. Some of it is cultural. Some of it may simply be his wisdom far exceeds our own. It's just kind of hard to follow somebody that's operating on that level. But I will tell you, in a day and age where people are searching for some meaning in life, and I think that's very true in our age, Ecclesiastes is a powerful book. If you're familiar with it, if you go back to chapter 1, Solomon really kind of begins with his conclusion. If you look at verse 2, "Vanity of vanity, says the preacher, all is vanity." Now this is his grand conclusion that's really going to drive the entirety of the book, but especially in chapter 1. So the question is, why is everything empty and grasping after the wind? And he summarizes that, beginning in verse 3, "What profit has a man from all of his labor in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away, another generation comes. The earth abides forever. The sun rises, the sun goes down, it hastens to the place where it arose. The wind goes toward the south and turns again to the north, and it whirls around continually and comes again on its circuit. All the rivers run into the sea, but the sea's not full. To the place from which the rivers come, there they return again. All things are full of labor. Man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing." Essentially, he says everything is empty because nothing really changes in this life. You live long enough and you see things just kind of happen over and over and over. And what you come to appreciate is that there's nothing that really is going to satisfy you. You might be at the top of the world. You may have, in the cycle of life, one of the great ups. Everything's grand for you right now. But you know as well as I do, that's all going to change. And ultimately what you're going to figure out is whether your life is kind of bad right now, whether your life is kind of good right now, just give it a while. It's going to change again, and you're not going to find any satisfaction by what's happening in your life. In verse 9 and 10, he says, that which has been is what will be, that which is done is what will be done. There's nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it might be said, see, this is new? It's already been in ancient times before us. There's nothing novel. Tomorrow, you're not going to experience something that's just never been experienced before, which suddenly gives meaning to life. It's going to be the same old grind. And then finally, when he gets to verse 11, in what is kind of one of the more morbid thoughts. There's no remembrance of former things, nor will there be remembrance of things that are to come by those who come after. We forget. And the things that have happened in the past, we very often find meaningless if we remember them at all. And so Solomon's conclusion is everything's kind of empty. He says it again, verses 12 through 15. Seen all the works that are done under the sun. Indeed, everything is vanity and grasping for the wind. What's crooked can't be made straight. What's lacking cannot be numbered. Life's just kind of a frustrating exercise. Now, you don't have to be a pessimist to see that there's a lot of truth in that. You can be the most optimistic person in the world, and yet if you read and think about what Solomon says, the first chapter, it rings true. And as he goes through the remaining 11 chapters in his experiment of life, he comes back to these themes over and over, but he adds some things. He also talks about injustice a lot, that life is a frustration because life is not fair. It doesn't always happen the way that it's supposed to happen, and that's a frustration. You can earn a living and then not be able to enjoy it because of some health circumstance. That's not fair. It's unjust, and it makes life frustrating. But one of the things he mentions much more frequently than we appreciate is that life is a vain, life under the sun, okay? He's not thinking about eternity now. Life under the sun is empty because we die. He introduces the thought in chapter 2, verse 14. The wise man's eyes are in his head, the fool walks in darkness, yet I myself perceive that the same event happens to all. So I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. Why was I then more wise? I said in my heart, this is vanity. There's no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever, since all that now is will be forgotten in days to come. And how does a wise man die? Just like a fool. Chapter 3, later on in this same chapter, beginning in verse 18. I hated all my labor in which I toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. Who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he'll rule over all my labor in which I've toiled, in which I've shown myself wise under the sun. This is vanity. It doesn't matter how I live, I'm going to die. And somebody else is going to have what I got. And what a frustration that is. Chapter 3, beginning in verse 19. What happens to the sons of men also happens to animals. One thing befalls them. As one dies, so dies the other. Surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage over animals. Again, he's talking about life in the temporal existence. For all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust. All return to the dust. Who knows the spirit of the sons of men which goes upward, and the spirit of the animal which goes down to the earth? So I perceive that nothing's better than that a man should rejoice in his own works. That is his heritage. Who can bring him to see what will happen after him? Then skip over to chapter 7, which is probably the most well-known of Solomon's comments on death. A good name, verse 1, is better than precious ointment, and the day of death better than the day of one's birth. Better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting. That is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. Sorrow's better than laughter. By a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. The heart of fools in the house of death. Chapter 8, beginning in verse 5, actually at the end of verse 5. A wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment, because for every matter there is time and judgment. Though the misery of man increases greatly, for he does not know what will happen. Who can tell him when it will occur? No one has the power of the Spirit to retain the Spirit. No one has power in the day of death. There is no release from that war. Wickedness will not deliver those who are given to it. And then you get to chapter 9, which is where I want to spend a little of our time. Let me tell you the reason that this train's running down this track this evening. I've had to do more funerals in my life than I care to even count. And there are certain passages of Scripture when you're talking at a funeral, especially, well, whether people are Christians or not, but especially if they're Christians. There are certain passages of Scripture that just naturally come to mind where God talks about death and the impact that death can have upon us. And chapter 9, beginning in verse 1, is probably the preeminent place where basically Solomon's about to say, look, we're going to die. But the only time, a lot of times, that we look at this or think about it or study it or reflect upon it or meditate upon it is when we're at a funeral. I don't think Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes so that we would have ample funeral material. I think one of the reasons that Solomon dwells so much on the concept of death in Ecclesiastes is because we have enough sense to understand that part of what makes life under the sun a frustration is the reality of death. If we didn't die, how much different would life be? And so Solomon says everything that we do is in some ways just grabbing for wind, because it doesn't matter what you accomplish, you're going to die. And I think there's more import here than only using these passages when we're remembering a loved one. So I want to make a couple of observations about death from Ecclesiastes chapter 9. And I don't want this to be a morbid consideration. I want us to look at it the way Solomon's looking at it, because what he's trying to do is help us to see wisdom as we deal with one of the realities of life that everybody has to deal with that makes life so frustrating. So he begins in chapter 9 and verse 1, I considered all this in my heart so that I could declare it all, that the righteous and the wise in their works are in the hand of God. People know neither love nor hatred by anything they see before them. All things come alike to all. One event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good, the clean, the unclean, to him who sacrifices, to him who does not sacrifice. As is the good, so is the sinner. He who takes an oath, as he who fears an oath. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that one thing happens to all. Truly the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil. Madness is in their hearts while they live. After that they go to the dead. And for him who is joined to all the living, there's hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion, and the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no more reward. The memory of them is forgotten. Their love, their hatred, their envy have now perished. Never more will they have a share in anything that is done under the sun. And if this all that Solomon said, I think I'd probably kind of have to conclude the way that a lot of people conclude about Ecclesiastes. It is a pessimistic, somber, absolutely morbid kind of study about life, and there is no hope in it, which I do not believe to be the case. In fact, I think if anything, what Solomon does here is to use some things about death to help us to learn how to live, to be driven by the fact that we're going to die. And so here are my observations. First of all, I want you to notice in verse 2 and 3 that none of us are exempt. We've all been to countless funerals. And what all funerals have in common that we've been to is they've involved somebody else dying. The reality is it's going to be mine one of these days. And it's going to be yours one of these days. And Solomon underscores that over and over in verse 3. One thing happens to all. And it really doesn't matter what kind of life you've led. Now here's the injustice part of it. The righteous or the wicked. The good or the clean or the unclean. The person who is given to worshiping God and offering sacrifices and maintaining that relationship, and the person who cares nothing about God. The good and the sinner, the person who is bound by His Word, and the person who would never, in their dishonesty, make a promise to you. Everyone is going to die. As you read through the Scriptures, that's underscored in a lot of ways. We're introduced to it very early in Scripture when we read about the genealogy of Seth, Adam and Eve's third son. If you go to chapter 5 of Genesis, we are very much, I think, impressed with the ages that these men lived. I mean, Methuselah's 969 years, if I remember. Enoch's in there. Enoch's the only one that we don't have his life number because after 300 some odd years, God took him. But the one thing that is said, and I think it's 8 or 9 times in Genesis chapter 5, is these people lived a long time and they begot a lot of children and they died. And the emphasis that God is making is this is different than the way that God created things. This is what happens because sin has entered the world. And even the lineage of godly men that we read about in Genesis chapter 5, they all end up the same. Moses would make a similar observation in the one psalm that we have a record that he wrote, Psalm 90. It's a psalm most of us are familiar with. Some of the older versions read something like, we spend our years like a tale that is told. The newer versions say like a sigh. But essentially what Solomon says is, we're like sleep. It's over real quick. We're like grass that comes up and the next day it baked in the sun. It dies. The days of our years of our lives are 70 years by reason of strength. 80, their boast is only labor and so on. It is soon cut off. I mean, ask some of these older folks. I'm not going to include myself in this category for this illustration. Ask some of these older folks how long it took 80 years to pass. And they're not going to say, whew, it's been a long life. What they're going to say is, man, it was yesterday. It was just yesterday when this was happening. It was just yesterday when I was at this age. It was just yesterday when I was at this point of life. And Moses makes the point. Teach us to number our days because the reality is we're going to die and it's going to go by so fast that when we turn around and look back, we're going to wonder where the time went. And I want you to appreciate that even Jesus had to conform to this truth. Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 27, as it is appointed unto men once to die, and after this the judgment, he goes on to say, even Jesus died. So I think it's imperative that you and I accept this at the outset. Doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter how good you are, doesn't matter what kind of health you maintain, doesn't matter the state your kids are in or the state your parents in or your spouse and all that. Throw all those factors out the window. None of us are exempt from dying. And he's going to make the point, and we'll come back to this at the very end, in verses 11 and 12, that we don't know when that's going to happen. I want you to go back to verses 4, 5, and 6 now, and I want to make a second observation. Not only are we all going to die, but the impact of death is just brutal. There's no other way to describe it. We all have to experience it with those that we love at some point and somehow, and there is no other way to describe it but brutal. Now, I would remind you, you and I have hope as Christians, but Solomon is really not exploring life after death for the faithful. What Solomon is exploring is, here's what happens as long as we are living on the earth. And so he says in verse 4, for him who is joined to all the living there is hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. But for the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. No more reward, the memory of them is forgotten, their love, their hatred, their envy have perished. Never more will they have a share in anything done under the sun. There is no hope in life. I mean, you think about that. Have you ever been in a circumstance in your life where you can say, I have nothing that I can grab hold of, nothing that I can look forward to, nothing that helps me get over the hump? Several of you keep asking about my circumstance, and I appreciate your interest. Knees getting better. I tell you, the biggest issue I've got right now is these stinking antibiotics I have to take 3 times every day. And I have to take them all the way to April the 3rd or 4th, whatever that Friday is. It might as well be the year 2,974 star date, as far as I'm concerned right now. But in reality, there is an end date. And I'm already looking forward to it. I'm already counting the days down. I want you to think about life from a serious standpoint. If we did not have an over-the-sun perspective, what hope would we have? Now, Solomon makes this observation. There is a little bit of hope for the living. Oh, there's always something to look forward to. There's always something that you can anticipate, whether it's watching your kids grow up or getting to see your grandkids the next time or seeing how your business unfolds or having some kind of retirement that you're going to be able to enjoy. There's always something, but not when you die. And that's his real point. You really want to see hopelessness. Hopelessness is really portrayed in the fact that once you're dead, that's it. There is nothing more to live for. The dead, he says in verse 5, know nothing. They have no more reward. Their love, their hatred, or the memory of them is forgotten. Their love, their hatred, their envy have perished. They'll never have a share in anything that's done under the sun again. So he contrasts here. If you're alive, there's some things you can look forward to. But once you die, and here's the brutal part of it, it's not going to be very long. Nobody's even going to remember that you were alive. That's kind of hard to grab hold of, isn't it? I mean, Tracy and I have 3 daughters, son-in-law, grandchild. Keep thinking, oh, they'll always know who we are. First of my grandparents died when I was 18. There's so much about them that I don't remember. So much about them that I don't know. We're just talking 2 generations in a close family where I got to know them and be with at least my maternal grandmother till I was in my 30s. But let me tell you what happens when you die. People don't, you're gone. And it's not going to be very long until it's very obvious that you didn't make any big mark upon the earth. Now you might leave some things. Mark in his talk this morning quoted from C.H. Spurgeon, who was a very famous and very capable preacher. But were it not for the fact that many of his sermons that were recorded during the days that he was preaching, I think in Louisville, were it not for those recordings, nobody would know who C.H. Spurgeon is today, and most people don't anyway. I sat in a group with a bunch of young people last year, and somebody mentioned D. Bowman, and several of these 18, 19, 20-year-olds went, who is that? No matter how much you think of yourself, and this is an exercise in humility, death is brutal because it erases your existence. And that's sobering. And here's the third observation. So what? We're all going to die, and death is brutal. And if we left right now, it would be, boy, don't save that sermon because all that's going to do is depress everybody. But I want you to notice what Solomon does with those thoughts. Beginning in verse 7. Go eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart. God has already accepted your works. Let your garments be always white and let your head lack no oil. Live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life in which He has given you under the sun. All the days of your vanity. This is your portion in life. And then the labor that you perform under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. There is no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you are going. He makes 3 or 4 applications here that I just want to point out to you. You and I are going to die. What do we do with that? Well, obviously, and if you go to chapter 12, where Solomon really does say, here's the conclusion of the whole matter: fear God and keep His commandments because we're going to stand in judgment. Everybody in this room understands already that we are living not for the here and now or the under the sun. We are living for what comes next. And if anything, death ought to remind us of how important that is. But it also should drive us to some things under the sun, like learning to enjoy simple blessings in life. We are a very spoiled people. We don't stop and think about the luxuries that we have. The turning on the faucet and have water that's drinkable and hot and cold. A refrigerator that keeps things nice and frosty. An air conditioner that keeps us comfortable. Going to eat somewhere and not having to worry about whether this food is healthy, whether it's diseased, I mean, we live in a country where many of those things are managed to the point that we just enjoy so many things in life. As Americans, we have freedoms to come and go. We are a prosperous people. The reality is, one of the grand themes that Solomon offers throughout Revelation, not only in this passage, is God's given us some blessings and we need to learn to enjoy that and appreciate that God gave us those blessings. It's not only spiritual blessings that we enjoy. That's the big thing. But are you living your life without stopping and appreciating how good life can be? If you go back and start backing up, chapter 8 and verse 15, he says this over and over. I commended enjoyment because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat, drink, and be merry. This will remain with him in his labor all the days of his life that God gives him. Chapter 7 and verse 14, if you keep backing up, you just trace this out. He starts it all the way at the beginning of the book. In the day of prosperity, be joyful. In the day of adversity, consider. Chapter 5, and beginning in verse 18, here's what I've seen. It's good and fitting for one to eat and drink and enjoy the good of all of his labor in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life that God gives him. It is his heritage. Chapter 3, verse 22. I perceive that nothing's better that a man should rejoice in his works. That is his heritage. Who can bring him to see what will happen after him? Back up a few verses to verse 12. I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and do good in their lives, and that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of his labor. It is the gift of God. Chapter 2 and verse 24, the one probably is the most well known. Nothing's better for a man that he should eat and drink, and his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This I saw, that it was from the hand of God. As Christians, not only do we have the grand blessings of redemption, but we have these blessings that God gives us that we need to learn to enjoy, because one of these days we're going to die and we're not going to be able to enjoy them anymore. It's that simple. Secondly, go back to chapter 9 and notice, if you would, verse 8, which is probably a continuation. But verse 8 says, let your garments always be white and your head lack no oil. If there is a variation here, I think all that he's saying is, yes, enjoy life, but maintain your sense of commitment to God, your morality. That's the idea of being anointed and having your garments all white. Don't give yourself over to the enjoyment of life to the point that it becomes the end-all, be-all of your existence, and you just chase your lusts. So I think there is a tempering there. Verse 9. Live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your life. We need to learn and appreciate the relationships that we have in this life. Now, Solomon points out marriage, which is kind of ironic to me. Because Solomon only had, 1,000 between wives and concubines. And so I guess if he didn't live joyfully with one, he could go live joyfully with another one. That's always been ironic to me. But in the wisdom of God, what he's saying is, this is one of the grand blessings of life. And yet, as Devin well pointed out this morning, so very often our eyes are strayed, our attention is focused elsewhere. Instead of looking for ways to cherish our relationships with our spouses, and for those of you who aren't married, our relationships with family, physical and spiritual. What we do is we find dissatisfaction at every turn. Instead of appreciating what we have, we're always looking at what else is out there. Look, you're going to die. And these people share life with you. And they make it worthwhile. And if we neglect those relationships and don't appreciate them and don't experience life together and enjoy the very things that God has given us, then we've missed one of the great blessings of God. And then finally in verse 10, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. There's no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you are going. There is not lasting satisfaction in working hard or playing hard or giving yourself to whatever your passions and enjoyments are. But there is some limited satisfaction. There is an under-the-sun enjoyment that we can get from living life with some degree of intensity. I think that's something God expects His people to do. Whether it is to work, which He has commanded of us, or whether it is leisure activities, which God people have always been able to enjoy in some way or another. Whatever it is that you're doing, do it as hard as you can, because there is some degree of enjoyment in that activity. Is it eternal? No. Is it going to satisfy you? Not in the big picture. Most of you know I enjoy playing golf. I don't know how many years ago it was the first time I broke par, which in golf's a big deal. For you, you may go, who cares? That's okay. But that's a big deal. And you would think that you break par or you make a hole in one, you just walk away, because it doesn't get any better than that. For those of you who hunt, you kill your trophy animal. For those of you who like cars, you save and trade till you finally have the end-all, be-all car that you've always wanted. I mean, there's so many ways to illustrate this. And you would think that when we reach that pinnacle of whatever it is, that we would go, well, there's no sense in me playing golf anymore. Or I'm done with fishing. I've caught my 10-pound bass. Or I've killed my 14-point. Or I've had a day where the bird dog did perfect and I hit every bird that I shot at. Life doesn't get any better. I'm quitting. But we don't. We're back out in the field. We're back out on the lake. We're back out on the course. We are cooking again. Whatever it is that you do passionately and you reach the pinnacle, it's not sufficient. Is it? But there is enjoyment in the doing. In verses 11 and 12, Solomon finishes these thoughts by saying, I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, or the battle to the strong, or bread to the wise, or riches to men of understanding, or favor to men of skill, but time and chance happens to them all. Man does not know his time, like a fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare. So the sons of man are snared in an evil time when it falls suddenly upon them. He's talking about death. And I think it's imperative that when we read these passages in Ecclesiastes that talk about death, that we read them with not just a view of finding comfort when a loved one dies. I can't tell you that I've ever heard very many lessons on death in Ecclesiastes that didn't have to do with, hey, it's better to go to the house of mourning, because the wise man will lay that to heart, so let's learn some good lessons today. I think for all of us, We need to be driven by the fact that we're all going to die, and death, when it happens, it's brutal. And so we need to learn to live life with some degree of appreciation and enjoyment what God has given to us. So I hope that'll help you this week. If we're going to try to set an example for the world, if we're going to try to show the world the appropriate way to live, we're not putting all of our eggs in the basket of temporal enjoyment, but we're not sitting around singing funeral dirges constantly because life is so miserable until we get to heaven. So God help us to learn the lessons that Solomon offers to us. Hope that'll give you something to think about this week. Thanks for your attention. If you're subject to the invitation, we could help you. We invite your response.